Nice. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started just here in a minute or two. As you log in, please put your name and organization in the chat. In just another minute or two, and we will start. Wonderful to see everyone. We've got a big full day today. Lots of great information. I think I'll just go ahead and jump in, Scott. I know as we get started here, time is going to be really tight, especially in this session. So we're going to abbreviate opening comments. Thanks for putting your name and where you are in the chat. Really appreciate that. And just want to say this Zoom call is the Success Factors for Nonprofits Executive Directors, and super excited to be here with Scott Schaffer for a whole series of sessions that he'll describe as we get on a little bit. I am really, as a former executive director, I am really looking forward to this conversation. Want to make sure you know this is all about the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. Here's our mission statement. Goal is to improve the lives of all Oregonians across the whole state. And we do that by strengthening the collective voice, the capacity, and strengthening nonprofits. So much amazing work happens in nonprofits, just and touch so many lives. We want to just take a minute and say thank you so much to the Ford Family Foundation for sponsoring this session. We really appreciate their ongoing support. And this session is fully recorded. After the session, you're going to be receiving a follow-up email from NAO that's going to have a link to our SharePoint site. And it's a little tricky to get in. If you have any problems, let us know. But the recording of this session and the slide deck are going to be available for you to look at afterwards. And basically, we're jumping in. So, Scott, I'll just say a word about you. So, Scott, I've gotten to know a little bit in a few organizing kind of conversations. Incredible background as a CEO through multiple organizations, strong consulting business, worked with nonprofits in a bunch of different phases, and a researcher. And his research in particular around success factors is, is just really fascinating. Taking some of the guesswork out of what do you prioritize, how do you do everything as a nonprofit executive director? And then just my name is Tim Rusk with NAO, about 4 months, and I'm here to co-host. I'm Ed McMahon, and Scott is Johnny Carson, if you can handle a reference that's that dated. Um, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, Tim, I will share my screen. And thank you for that introduction. And welcome to the first of 4 sessions. We're going to look at success factors for nonprofit organizations, focused on executive directors and how you can best do your job. So Public Interest Management Group, I just want to comment that we work in the US and Canada, focused on financial sustainability of nonprofits. And just a comment, we do some work in Canada, and the entity there is called Public Interest Management Canada. But for clarity, I am based in Washington State in the US, and work primarily in the Western states with nonprofits of all shapes and sizes. And this is really, this series is inspired by really all of you and the challenge of being an executive director. And there are so many opinions and thoughts on how to do that job well. And which we're trying to bring some order to that and some wisdom, perhaps some structure to how you can decide how to guide and lead your organization. There are 4 sessions coming up. This one focuses on organizational strategy and planning for success. The next 4, you have the schedule for them. They'll look at different dimensions of successful nonprofit management. And we'll be wrapping up the first part next month. The series also has a phase 2. And we'll talk more about that as we move forward. But that's a deep dive. I think there's a lot of potential benefit there. Peer-to-peer work, one-on-one consulting, and that's something that you can consider. That doesn't start until the fall. So we'll talk more about that as we move forward. For this session, we have three parts. Part 1, I'll give background on what is this framework, this success factors framework that we're talking about. And for the second, we are going to talk about best practices around organizational strategy, specific best practices. And then for the third part, we'll talk about a little bit about applying them in your organization. Now, we have just an hour and 15 minutes today. These subjects are potentially very big conversations. So we're not pretending that we're going to do everything on these success factors. Probably any given one of them could justify an hour's discussion. So we'll have time as we move forward. If we don't get to discuss everything that we want to, we'll have more time for discussion. And then particularly in session 4 for this spring, we'll have an opportunity to dig into those topics which seem most ripe for a deeper dive. And of course, in phase 2, there will be more opportunities to do that as well for those who wish to continue in phase 2. So we're think of it as an overview and things to stimulate your thinking. By the way, there is a paper that I think NAO has sent the link out. It's a white paper that Jim White of NAO and I co-wrote. It's a true white paper because it is co-written by Mr. White, and that paper goes into a lot of the details. But I'll give an overview here just to give you more context in my voice. Success and success factors. So the motivation for this, when I first met Jim, we really clicked in a first conversation, which was, I'm not sure when it was. It might have been in 2015, and I was starting to think about a project like this, and he basically said, sign NAO up as a partner for this. The idea is that here in the nonprofit management field, where I've worked for most of my career, there's lots of talk about what are best practices. There are lots of opinions, and often they are exactly that. They're someone's opinion. And now there are some very smart people working in our fields, and I think very often their opinions are wise ones, but sometimes they're not backed up by anything. And so my hunch was that sometimes they're right and sometimes they may not be. Ideas become gospel. They become conventional wisdom. And sometimes conventional wisdom can be wrong. If it gets repeated often enough, people stop questioning it. So I wanted to know, just as a consultant, what actually does work? Is there a way to figure this out? So we set out to try to test these ideas. We designed an applied research study. We had 35 measurable variables. These are the factors. And then we had a tangible metric for organizational success. That's actually part of the secret sauce here. And then what we did is we included 43 organizations. We did a deep dive into each one of these, a very detailed organizational assessment where we collected this data. We then drew correlations and to determine, well, how successful is the organization, and then which of these factors do we see patterns in among the most successful and the least successful organizations. So again, all of this is described in a somewhat more detail in the white paper. So we by the way, we also applied it. We did a historical analysis of retroactively with 40 organizations to try to cross-validate these findings, and we found very similar results, not identical, but pretty similar. And so a lot of organizations, a lot of data. I'll also mention that after this study was complete, we did further study or further assessments of about 15 other organizations, and found essentially the same patterns were emerging there. So a lot of good information. But what's interesting is in these 35 measurable variables, the conventional wisdom was validated 17 times. That's less than half. So that was interesting. In some of them, it wasn't clear. We saw low correlations, but you might be wondering, well, what is success? How do you measure success? Well, and this is kind of an interesting topic, but we came up with a combination metric that included 50% of it is achievement of mission-related results, whatever those are in your field as an organization. 30% is financial health, so we had very specific financial metrics, and 20% is growth. And so this is so it's a combination of these elements, and we looked at a period of 3 years, and each organization had a score. And this definition has it has been pretty resilient over time. People have generally felt, yeah, it's a pretty reasonable definition. Obviously, it's not the only possible one that we could use. So what are these factors? They're distinct organizational attributes and practices. And they're measured across a spectrum. We evaluated them through detailed interviews, and we surveyed 4 different stakeholder groups: management, general staff, board members, and external stakeholders. We had pretty detailed surveys, and we looked at their program and financial data. So we pulled all of this together, and the success factors fall into 5 categories, and that, to an extent, mirror how we've designed this series of webinars. And they enable us to draw conclusions based on correlations. Now, the real point of this is to help you determine directional consistency with these findings and set your priorities. One thing I want to say, though, and I don't want this point to be lost, is that in our 43 organizations that we studied, some were very successful, some were pretty unsuccessful, and then we had, a lot of them were somewhere in between. There wasn't a single organization that had a high score on all of the success factors that were, in other words, those variables that were most closely associated with success. So there is no perfect organization, and it's really a question of directional consistency. For the most part, are we heading in the right direction? And that's where I think it can be most helpful. Is this data conclusive? I want to be very clear here. This is not an attempt to one-up those people who like to pronounce what they believe the truth is. Instead, this is we're approaching this in the spirit of skepticism, and we do not believe this data is conclusive yet. We think that more research is needed and would be helpful to clarify some of this data. We believe that over time, probably many of these conclusions will be backed up if we were able to get more data. If we aren't, I'm sorry, if we don't get more data, then we think that this is a good starting point for discussions. some of these correlations that we found are very strong. And we have to keep in mind some caveats also about statistical correlations. You've probably heard this before. Correlation does not imply causality necessarily. So just because two things are correlated doesn't mean they cause each other. And here are some fairly entertaining examples here. These are things that have consistently shown high correlations when people measure them. And pool drownings and nuclear energy production. If someone can explain the causality of that, I'm at a loss, but I could almost explain the last one in my mind, if I had to come up with it. High school graduates and pizza consumption. High school graduates make more money, they can afford more pizza. I don't know. But no obvious causality necessarily. So just because we see a correlation doesn't mean there's causation, but this is important. That doesn't mean we automatically just dismiss any conclusions based on correlations, because when causality exists, you usually do see a correlation. It's lightning and thunder. So we don't always hear thunder when there's lightning. I was just in a massive electrical storm in Texas last week, and they had never seen anything like it. There was like thousands of lightning strikes within like 15-minute period where I was, and most of it did not cause thunder. But when you hear thunder, that was caused by lightning. That's been shown to be the cause. Guns and gun-related crimes, high correlation there. You can also have negative correlations that show causality. So airbags and passenger fatalities. The more airbags we get, the fewer passenger fatalities we get. So we do not want to dismiss correlations. It's a very powerful statistical technique. And I think very likely there is causality within these findings that we have. So I just wanted to present that as, some background for you. I encourage you to read the article. We believe, and the study actually has a lot of support for this idea, is that seeking validated evidence is an improvement over intuition, groupthink, and hearsay. Not that those things are all bad, they aren't, but evidence is very helpful, and it has proven to be a good way to make decisions. There's a gentleman named Daniel Kahneman. He actually just passed away very recently. He's a Nobel Prize winner, and he wrote a great book called Thinking Fast and Slow, among others, that talks about the way our minds work. And the book, this is not summarizing the book in any way, but one quote of his is just the simple fact that people are overconfident and put too much faith in our intuitions. It's just human nature. So all of us do that. So this is a framework that I'd like you to think about as we go through these 4 sessions. It's a process for decision making. We start at the top, identify the problem that we're looking at or an opportunity. We ask questions, we collect data, then we analyze that data. We generate alternatives. Based on the alternatives, we deliberate and we make decisions. And then we take action based on those decisions, and then we circle back. We evaluate. And maybe that problem is solved, or maybe we still have opportunities for improvement. So it's a cycle, and it's a good way to think about how we would use information like this. So now I have a question for all of you. We'll do our first poll. We'll do interactive polls from time to time. We're going to ask you to do this. And Natalia, can I turn it over to you to poll the group? We'd like you to select options here for question 1. And let's see what the group thinks. There we go. So please take a look at which of the following areas do you face challenges running your organization? What do you all think? Okay, we're starting to get responses. So, staying fundraising is a big one. Strategic planning as well. Interesting results. So it looks like this is great. I love this. I love this feature, and I love seeing data. I love seeing data in real time. Fundraising appears to be the biggest challenge. That's that's not surprising. It's often a challenge. And then the others are mixed, among other things. Financial management is up there, but very interesting. So yeah, so I think folks here will find you'll find a lot to chew on in this session and others. Strategic planning is one of the ones that's relevant to this particular session, but really all of these sessions are related to fundraising, and the success factors cover all these areas. So thank you for weighing in there. So let's move on here.
Scott, I think people can't see the results. And oops, I tried
Really?
to send it into everyone's chat.
Oh, okay. I thought that was shared generally. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, what I saw there was that I think 57% indicated fundraising. That was highest. We had 40% for financial management, then 35% for in the 35% range for the others, program management, strategic planning, and board and governance was relatively lower, but we had a good mix across the
Yep.
board. So,
Perfect.
yeah.
And eventually it came through. So eventually people were able to see the results.
Oh, okay. So let me ask this, Tim, since we'll have other polls moving forward. Is it possible for everyone to see the results as they tabulate?
Not as they are tabulating, but after the poll closes, then I click share, and then that's when everyone can see
Got it.
everybody's.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We'll make it work one way or another. Okay. So let's move into section part 2, best practices. Best practices in organizational strategy. So I started with this one because strategy is the most high level way to think about our organization. I thought it would be a good way to start. And we also had a bunch of the variables we looked at did have high correlations with success. So when I talk about success factors, what I'm specifically talking about is it's those variables among the 35 that we looked at. It's those attributes and practices of nonprofit organizations that showed high correlations with organizational success. There were just 17 of them in that category, 17 out of 35. So we'll focus our attention on those 17. A bunch of them were in the organizational strategy category. So there's a lot to talk about. So strategy is really, I think of strategy as it's kind of like the map of where we're going to. Strategy is where's our organization headed, and from a fairly high level, how are we going to get there? So like a navigation plan doesn't have all the details of our day-to-day work, but it encompasses where we're headed and how we're going to get there. So turns out there are a lot of differences in how organizations approach this. This is how I think about organizational strategy. There's a programmatic component, operational, and financial, and they're all integrated together. That's how I like to think about it as a consultant. Now, best practice 1, clarity of theory of change. So we looked at how clear and consistent was the understanding of an organization's theory of change across different stakeholder groups. And so basically, we asked different types of stakeholders. We asked the staff, we asked the board, we asked funders and other external stakeholders. We asked them, what do you see as the primary purpose of this organization's work? And what we found was interesting. What we found was the most successful organizations, they generally had a consistent understanding. The least successful organizations, they were all telling us something different. So I'm overgeneralizing a bit, but being clear about why are we here? What is the purpose of our work turns out to be very important to how successful the organization will be. Now I'm going to introduce this very briefly. We won't have a chance to go into it in detail, but this is a public interest management group construct of the nonprofit business model. And we will go into this in phase 2 of the of this series, and we may have a chance to talk more about it in session 4. But there are 5 elements of a business model. They're all interconnected. The first one, and the most foundational, is the theory of change. The theory of change, some organizations, they get very into this and make it very elaborate. I like to think of it as more simple and practical. I define theory of change as the logical pathway for how the organization will change the world for the better. I mean, that's why we have nonprofits. It's to change the world for the better. So these actions and interventions in the middle, I think of those as programmatic elements. The theory is simply the construct for how we're going to do this. And a theory of change should have 3 things. It just explains what's the state of the world now. You know, we have a certain problem that we're trying to address. What is our desired state in the future? What does the world look like when this problem is alleviated or solved? And then what are the steps needed to happen in between? So I like to think of theory of change as pretty simple and straightforward. I actually think one of the problems is when it's not clear to different people, the theory of change can be too complicated. And if it feels like you're playing a game of Twister, for those of you old enough like me to remember Twister, if it feels like you're playing a game of Twister to justify what your programs are, then you might need to rethink that. So the theory of change should make a lot of sense, and it can be validated. So we'll get to that in a minute. But so my point here is really simply that having a clear understanding, a consistent understanding of the theory of change among different groups, both inside and outside the organization, is associated with success.
So Scott, this is like the elevator speech. You know, this is the core of the elevator speech. How does our nonprofit make progress on the mission? It needs to be pretty simple, compelling, and everyone needs to understand it.
Well put, Tim. Thank you. Yeah. And now one of the themes here that I want to mention, so I'm going to talk about these different strategy elements, is now just because a theory of change was unclear to some different groups doesn't mean that the theory of change was wrong. The actual theory of change, most organizations have at least an implied theory of change. Like, it's a generally understood, here's what we're trying to do. I worked for years ago, worked for a food security, food bank type of organization. And our theory of change, I don't think we ever wrote it out, but it was kind of understood by everyone. We're trying to take surplus food from over here. We're trying to get it to people that need it. That'll make them healthier, and so on and so forth. Everyone understood it. And even though we hadn't written it out. So when people don't understand it, that could either be a function of, well, maybe you are playing a game of Twister there, and it's just hard to explain what a game of Twister is to different people. Or it could be simply communication, that we haven't taken the time and effort to communicate it clearly. But either way, it's a question of just getting people on the same page. So the next one is proof of concept. So the depth of evidence for efficacy of program methodologies. So if we go back, I'm going to always hesitate to go backwards in my slide deck, but I'll do it here. So if we go back to this diagram, which again, I apologize, I'm not explaining all these 5 elements as of yet, but it starts with theory of change. The second one is the programmatic approach. What are we doing conceptually to define the programs that are going to change the world? This is where we actually start changing the world. The theory is just the idea. The programmatic approach is how we start doing it and what we're going to do. So the question here is about proof of concept. How do we know that these programmatic approaches actually work? How do we know that? Well, we have to ask the question, how do we know it? And it turns out when the organizations we looked at, that many organizations, how did they know their programs worked? It's obvious. That's how they knew it worked, because it was obvious. They obviously work. Haven't you observed our programs? Isn't it obvious that they work? And I'm reminded of a teacher that I had in high school, and she would just cross her arms and say, "No, it's not obvious." And of course, it's not obvious. We have to actually get some information. Now, the question is, in some cases, it's hard to measure how effective is our program. So that is undeniable. But most organizations, I think it was the majority, over 50% of the organizations in the study didn't actually have tangible evidence. But it turns out that those that did, when they had proof of concept, evidence that backed up, actual data that backed up the efficacy of what they were doing, they tended to be more successful. And so here are some examples of how proof of concept could be developed. You can look at client outcome data. Sometimes that's very hard to get. Now, obviously, there are many different nonprofits, and I know we have a very diverse audience here today as well. So all of these things won't necessarily apply to your organization, but we might have client outcome data. Do the people who participated in our program, do we have tangible information of how it affected them? We can do surveys, we can do interviews, we can survey our staff. We can survey our staff on their observed experience, which is secondhand information, but it's secondhand information from experts who have knowledge about our programs. Academic or field research, I'm not the biggest fan of this because it can be expensive and time consuming, but it certainly has been done. Sometimes it's done in the field where you can refer to studies. You don't have to pay for them, but you can say, hey, we saw a study that showed that our type of after-school education is highly effective in reducing dropout rates, for high school dropout rates or something like that. So you can find research that may back up what you do. And you can also do third-party program evaluation, which, you hire an evaluator. That's, something that some organizations do. But what I like about these first 3 is that they're very DIY. They're not expensive and anybody can do them. But understand that, the proof of concept, it's the simple act of doing it is what was correlating with success here. Okay. So raises a question, how does your organization establish that your theory of change is or is not valid? It's a rhetorical question for right here, but it's a question that you can think about. Okay. Okay, this is one of my favorites because it's an interesting one because of its simplicity. Definition of results, goals, and objectives. Now, this is kind of dense language, but it's actually pretty simple. In organizational strategies, such as strategic plans, how specific were the future targets for the outcomes we want to see? So I'll give you some examples, but how did we in our plans specify the results that we're seeking? So the organizations that had specific goals, and well, I'll just leave it at that for now. The organizations that had specific goals were much more likely to be successful than the organizations that had vague or very general goals. So the interesting thing to me about this is that it takes very little time and effort to write these goals, just to put them on paper. And it was simply what we're measuring here is not whether the goals were achieved or not. We're just measuring whether they had the goals in the first place, goals and objectives in the first place. Does that make sense? So it's almost as if simply by having specific goals and objectives, the organization was more specific, more successful. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Perhaps organizations that tended to be more successful were already thinking in terms of specific goals. Regardless, it doesn't take a huge amount of effort to get specific goals and objectives. Yet fewer than half of the 43 organizations actually had them. I'll give you an example. This is a very common goal from strategic plans. So I got to read all this strategic plans, one of the interesting parts of my job as the assessor here. We will grow fundraising through additional events, donor outreach, and grant prospect research. Well, that sounds pretty thoughtful, doesn't it? But it's also very vague. So when I see this, I wonder, well, who's going to do what? How will we know when we've accomplished it? So that is not an example of a specific goal. Here's another
God, that one sounds like a wish.
It is
I
a wish.
wish.
Yeah. Yeah, there's kind of a cliche out there that a wish is not a strategy. Here's another one. We will eliminate our deficit by growing individual and grant fundraising. Well, that is a worthy goal, and I would recommend that anyone that has a deficit do look at their individual and grant fundraising possibly among other things. But I have a hard time picturing how this goal as specified or as presented here actually will accomplish that. So that's another example of a vague goal. Now here's a different kind of goal. We will eliminate our deficit by growing major gift fundraising by 25% and growing grant fundraising by 35% over the next 4 years. And then in parentheses, it implies there's a chart with year-by-year projections. So we're setting now very specific goals, which allows us to hold ourselves accountable. And it also kind of forces us to figure out, well, what are we going to do to reach these goals? What are the specific, like, are we going to send more? Are we going to send more mailers? Are we going to engage major donors in particular ways? Do we have to engage our board members to go out and do one-on-one meetings with our donors? What are we going to do? So this goal sets that up, and that's an example of a more specific goal. You tended to see goals like this. We tended to see goals like this with the more successful organizations. Now here's a goal. I've seen goals like this in a lot of strategic plans. And you know, I look at this kind of in amazement that like, like, why would you even bother writing this? Because you know, everyone's committed to their jobs. Of course, we're going to continue to meet a standard of excellence. It doesn't point us in any direction that suggests a strategy of any sort. And so that was a typical of a vague goal. Now here's an example of a specific goal. And then going back to this organization that is focused on boosting high school graduation rates. This doesn't specify how we're going to do it particularly, but it does give a specific goal. And it allows us to be accountable and forces us to look at how we're going to do it. And if we didn't reach it, it also kind of forces us to ask the question, well, why didn't we reach it? And what should we do differently? Okay, so I'll take a deep breath. We'll have an opportunity for some questions here. I'm just going to present this one, and we'll take the pulse of the group here. So best practice 4, partner and stakeholder engagement. So to what degree and what is the range of stakeholder engagement included as core components of the organizational strategy? So this is an interesting one that I wouldn't necessarily have assumed would be among the highest correlations, but it was. And so we looked at an organization and said, of their strategic goals, to what degree were engaging with partners and other stakeholders outside of the organization? To what degree was that part of the main strategy? And so turns out that organizations that were partnership oriented did tend to be more successful. And an interesting thing there is that it does involve the cooperation of someone else, but I think this gets to the mindset of the partnership orientation. Do we play well with others? Are we thinking about, kind of engaging and forming coalitions larger than ourselves? And it turns out that's a very successful practice. So an example here, we will develop a strategic alliance with a specific school district to link our after-school and in-school programming. So that's a specific type of strategic plan goal that we might see. We will commit staff and board resources to this specific coalition. I don't think this actually exists. To do statewide advocacy work, and we'll specify the commitments. That's another example of the type of partnership activity that, as a major strategic goal, was linked with success. Here's a question for you. I'd love for people to just type in the chat. What other types of partnerships are your organizations involved in? Could folks type in an example, and Tim and Natalia, let me know what you're seeing.
Yeah, we'll watch the chat. Scott, it seems like what's the correlation is around those intentional partnerships. So it's not just go to meetings. Right. You're not just sending staff to meetings. There's an objective or a goal with that partnership.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Partnerships with agencies that have a shared population. Here's a group, other behavioral health and housing organizations that are aligned with mission.
Yes.
And populations they serve. Partnerships with camps to host our enrichment programs. We asked our mental health providers to train our staff in suicide arrangements. So partnerships around staff training.
I love it.
Collaborative events for families. We serve with other organizations doing similar events. Partnership with state and federal agencies. Partnerships with schools.
This is great. Yeah. You know what? I am constantly amazed that, we hear in the news about, things that imply that, our country is dysfunctional, our society is dysfunctional, people can't get along, we have conflicts, and there are, nonprofits of all shapes and sizes, they really collaborate very, very effectively. And I think the distinction here is, so I'm not surprised to see all those great examples there, but nonprofits are very partnership oriented generally, and they do it well. And when you think about it, these are very high level social skills, I guess you would say,
Yeah,
where
that have
they
a lot
involve
of emotional
because
skill.
emotional intelligence and diplomacy, conflict resolution, all these things are at play in these partnerships because you're dealing with an entity that has a different culture. I'll give you an example. You mentioned organizations that partner with state and local government. Well, government agencies tend to have very different cultures than nonprofits, and yet nonprofits are good at working with different levels of government. And so uh, these skills are really there. What's interesting to me, though, is we see a distinction. We get back to the success factors results, that even though a lot of partnerships are at play, the less successful organizations did not necessarily make these strategic goals. They may be doing it, but they weren't making it the major goals of the organization, whereas the more successful organizations generally did. So that's an interesting thing to me. This is not saying that less successful nonprofits don't do partnerships well.
Interesting. Scott, there's a couple more in here. Kim says we're responsible for a network for the entire state. So we actively build relationships with people and organizations in that network. And our goals are programmatic improvement, capacity building, and advocacy. I love she can put the goals out there.
I love it.
There's another one, partner with fellow advocacy organizations to create coalitions, temporary housing collaboratives with operators, school, social workers, youth services, partner with Care Oregon, um, uh, to work on funding and programming,
Yeah.
and then strategic partnerships outside our nonprofit world.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. To increase connections, advocacy, and partnership.
That's
Nice.
great.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all. These are wonderful examples. And so I guess to kind of wrap up this part of the conversation or discussion, you can think about how these partnerships are leveraged in your own strategic plan goals and how you can maybe step on the gas with some that are really essential to how effective your organization can be. It's something to consider in your own strategy development. Now, there's one more best practice, investment in revenue generation. Revenue generation is basically it's fundraising and sales. And sales I use as a general term for fee-for-service income, which, by the way, fee-for-service income is the largest income stream for nonprofits as a whole. Fundraising is not. Fundraising comes after that. The fee-for-service would include things like reimbursements from government and things like that. We don't usually think of it as sales if we have a government contract to reimburse us, but it is. If you think about it, it's a relationship with an agency. You want that contract to be renewed. You want better terms perhaps in the future. And so where does your revenue come from? And what are those staff functions related to ensuring that revenue will continue or enhancing it in the future? So those are investments. Are there investments in your strategy to build revenue. Now, if your revenue comes from contracts, then and your performance on the contracts is what gets you more contracts, then your investment might be in quality control and enhancement, ensuring that you're just dazzling that contracting agency with your magnificence in delivering services. Or it might be investing in relationship building. It might be ensuring that you have adequate staff to do the reporting so we get the reports in on time, because those reports are so time consuming and nitpicky. Being able to compliance can be an investment in revenue generation. Whatever is going to result in renewed and increased revenues in the future, those are investments in revenue generation. In fundraising, it could be more staff, could be hiring more specialized fundraising staff focused on individuals, might be hiring grant writer staff, might be investing in a new data system that helps us understand and communicate with our donors better, might be hiring a consultant to help plan a new campaign. It might be prospect research. There are a lot of things we could invest in, but when we saw organizations that had budgets that showed investment in revenue generation, and we were looking at percentages of budgets to give us the degree of how much they were investing, the more they were investing, the more successful they were. Now, I'm not implying it was because of that investment, and you could probably look at this from the other side and say, well, if they were already financially successful, then maybe they had more money to invest in this. Well, isn't that kind of the cycle that we get in? We want to be successful so that we can invest in this, but to the extent that we can invest in generating more revenue, it is correlated with success. And so this, I think, is an important one. Here are just some examples. Let you digest that. Now, one of them, active board involvement in donor engagement and outreach. That's not a financial investment, but it still would be an investment. I didn't talk about infrastructure very much before, but having a good CRM system or donor data system can be very important, I think. And very often those types of things fall to the back burner. So finding ways to fund these, engaging in creative discussions with our funders to figure out how we can make these investments can be very important. Can you think of any other investment in the generation of revenues that I haven't touched on? Do we have any examples out there from the field? Well, think about that. We'll have other opportunities to revisit this one, I'm sure.
Lobbying for state funding
Oh, yeah,
is in the chat.
absolutely.
Thanks, Rachel.
I love that one. And I actually have an anecdote I can share with you on that one, that one of the organizations I remember well from the original Success Factors study, it was an NAO member and most of the 43 organizations were NAO members. There were a good number of others from California and some from Washington. But one of these, their biggest challenge in terms of revenues was that the contracts just didn't fund the full costs of services. And so the primary recommendation in their assessment was that they have a series of discussions with the state about renegotiating the terms of the contract. When I checked in with the executive director about a year later, she said they did that, and the state did renegotiate the contract and gave them much better terms. So
that's a great story.
It wasn't just for them, though. It was also their organizations doing similar work elsewhere in the state. So I don't think it was, I'm not so um, I don't want to overstate my own assessment's impact there, but so this probably was something that was at least being kicked around already. But the point being, advocacy, if you get government funding, advocacy can be a huge thing, not just for the good that it does to public policy, but for how it impacts your organization.
Yes. Scott, there's a couple more here. Social enterprise businesses like Goodwill stores, corporate sponsorships, cultivation, stewardship events, like donor events without solicitation, just that donor acknowledgement and thank you. Here's Joe says, we rent parts of our facility to mission aligned businesses. It's a good source of flexible funding that
Yeah,
also supports our mission.
yeah. Um, uh, rental income and fee for service that is not directly related to your mission, those revenues can impact your mission. And as an example, some years ago, I was executive director of an environmental education center we would rent out our facility on weekends and sometimes over the summer to groups that were doing weddings. And that had nothing to do with our mission directly, but it supported our mission. Became a kind of a profitable little side business. You have to be careful about, with your IRS qualifications there, but worst case is you have to pay some tax on that. But in our case, we didn't. So yeah, that's great. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, everyone. So think about the impact of these investments on your budget, short term and long term. It's just something that you can think about. Even if you don't have the money now to make the investments, if you know what they would be, that might generate ideas for how you can get funding to support this. Okay, so I've given you 5 practices. These are 5 of the 17 best practices. I'm curious, and we have a poll now. Natalia, if you can send this out. Which practices do you believe are most likely to make a difference? So we're asking for a single choice here. So forcing you to choose just one. Okay, this is a horse race. Now, Tim, can you clarify for me? Am I the only one who can see this, or can you see it? Can everybody see it? You're on mute. Sorry.
You and I and Natalia are seeing the results as
Okay.
they accumulate. Natalia will end the poll, and then that gets posted to
Yeah. Okay.
everyone.
So it's still a horse race. We've got 15 have answered. Still going up. We'll give it another minute here. So which is most likely to make a difference in your organization over the next 2 years? And the winner is specific results, goals, and objectives. And I'm really glad to see that one because that's one that I think everyone probably can do. And if you're doing strategic planning in the next couple of years, in second place here, so that was 37%. In second place with 26% was strategic partnerships. And I'm also glad to see that one. The investment in revenue generation also did well, and I'm very happy to see that. The theory of change, proof of concept were lower. Not surprised that those are lower, but it's a very interesting result. 40% now. Specific results, goals, and objectives. Very nice. Actually, over 40%. So yeah, so thank you. Thank you all for giving us some data so we can make some database conclusions here. Shall I click end poll now, Tim?
I think Natalia just did.
Good. Okay. All right. Great. So, by the way, we have a worst practice. So you remember way back on the correlation slides, I showed you a couple examples of negative correlations, whereas one thing goes up, the other goes down. And we have a worse practice for it. It's a negative correlation. When we had strategies where there was an emphasis on new revenue sources, a revenue source would be like a particular funder. It could be a new revenue stream, like, we're going to tap into some group of donors we've never worked with before. But to what degree do we rely on one or more new revenue sources within 5 years? When groups relied more on a new revenue source moving forward, the more they relied on a new revenue source, the less successful they were as an organization. So, and vice versa. So what I took out of that was, it's kind of the old political adage, you start with your base. You start where you have strength and nurture that. Put your resources there before you start branching out. It's not to say that we never want to look into new revenue sources, but we don't want to depend on them, apparently. So just put that out there. Okay, so we're doing well on time. We have about close to 15 minutes left. We will end on time, and we will have some opportunity for discussion. I wanted to talk a little bit about applying best practices, and just give you some thoughts to chew on. When you think of doing strategic planning, think of doing strategic planning with small s and a small p in lieu of elaborate strategic planning with a capital S and a capital P. When I see the capital S and the capital P, I start thinking of really detailed processes involving the board, involving facilitated retreats and things like that. I'm not sure that that's necessary every year. In fact, I'm not sure that's necessary every 2 or 3 years. I think they can be very useful every now and then, maybe every 3 to 5 years. But when I think of small s, small p strategic planning, I just think of taking time to think about the big picture. And usually some type of a small group process is useful. I don't think the whole board needs to be involved in it all the time, but I think that, executive director, maybe some senior staff, maybe some colleagues, maybe, a couple of people on the board, whatever your group is that you like to kick ideas around with and generate ideas. So consider reimagining what strategic planning is and not making it into such a big elaborate thing that it's like planning a wedding, because that can be an obstacle. We think about data. Think about doing a data audit and have a strategy around data, because a lot of these best practices were around using data and collecting it. So just think about, what data do you have? What data do you need to evaluate your programs, to monitor performance? What can you glean from your current systems and what can't you? What other elements can you acquire at low cost? So nonprofits have scarce resources. We're not multinational corporations that can put many millions of dollars into data systems and data analysis. But where's the low-hanging fruit? I don't think it has to be expensive or hugely time-consuming to get some good, tangible information. And I come back to this diagram just to circle back and reemphasize that this kind of process lends itself to good strategy. And that's one of the things that I take away from the success factors data on the strategy elements. Also, just generally generative discussions. I know of one consultant who recommends that every board meeting include generative discussions. Keeps them interesting. You can tap into different outside the box ideas. Keeps people engaged. It's also good with staff. Sometimes just have informal conversations around generating ideas. And, you can think about who should be involved, who should not be involved at early stages, but this is kind of I think it's a best practice just to keep ideas fresh. And because let's face it, many organizations have limited capacity. We have a ton of work to do. We have staff vacancies sometimes. We have all kinds of day-to-day challenges. It can be hard to find time to just think. So making time to do it is something that I think is kind of behind a bunch of these strategy factors, success factors. This is just emphasizing a point that I made. Hey, here's a question for you. Do you have if anyone has a personal best practice for finding that strategic thinking time? You don't have to respond to this, but if you have one to share with the group, I'm sure folks would be interested. So think about that. While you're thinking about that, and
Feels impossible, people say.
it does. I fully relate to that. Fully
Yeah.
relate to that.
Have dedicated no meeting days, block off my calendar every Friday for this purpose, and for the whole, to work with the whole team. These are great.
I like that. Yeah.
Schedule regular focus meetings, so they can work on one issue during that hour.
Yeah, building it into the calendar.
Quarterly check-ins. Mornings are blocked off for the first hour of the morning. I start before others. Nothing like getting there early before it gets busy.
Really bird.
You're getting a lot of response to this.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like the small S idea of strategic planning. That seems good. Dedicated Monday lunch check-ins with the team. Good for talking about just sort of the general state of things. Again, Fridays are a great time to study and research. Recurring meetings. Yep, time blocking.
Yeah, building in a calendar. I'm reminded of years ago. This is way before there were smartphones around. That I found that if I was in the office, I could not possibly do thinking like that, and I didn't really want to. I found that at home wasn't the best place to do it either. I kind of stumbled across, accidentally found out that when by sitting in hotel lobbies, I all of a sudden was able to just think and generate these ideas. I didn't keep in mind I didn't have a phone with me, so I wasn't going to be interrupted. And I probably was just waiting for a meeting with someone that we just happened to be meeting in the lobby. I showed up early. I just found that kind of cafe-like energy there that wasn't specifically distracting. It was like just right for just sitting and thinking. So getting into a different physical space, I think, was the idea. Turning off the phone, maybe, but lots of good approaches. I'm glad people are finding that time, or at least a lot of people. And for those who haven't been able to find time, think about ways to build that in. And so strategy is really important. And there have been studies done that go way beyond this study that show that for businesses and other organizations, that when you lay out a compelling vision for the organization and a compelling plan for doing it, that can make a huge difference in and of itself. And so the quality of strategy is very important, even if it doesn't have to take a lot of time to generate it. So it's not the quantity or the cost necessarily. So, wow, that was a lot. We've covered a lot in this first session. And I'm really excited about the second one, but we have some time here for some discussion. Anything occur to people? Any questions about what we covered? Any thoughts that bubble up for you?
And just unmute yourself and just jump in.
I know I said it in the, hi, my name's Sarah. I'm with
Hi,
Thrive
Sarah.
Central Oregon. Hi. This is great. I appreciate it. Thank you both. I know I said it in the chat, but yeah, that's still, I'm like taking notes about the small S strategic planning. Because we absolutely get immobilized by coming up with the big plan and how to even set up the meeting to make the big plan for the capital S strategic planning plan. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so simple. Let's just like incorporate it into the monthly or bi-monthly conversations that we're having. Yeah, so I'm excited about that.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, we can make the idea of strategic planning into such a big thing that it just doesn't happen. Or when it starts happening, everyone dreads it so much that it has a kind of a negative energy.
Suzanne, it looks like you unmuted.
I do have a question. So the problem that I am dealing with is I can see a strategic plan and I think it could work. But I have an organization that has one idea that they're not willing to give up about the organization. So I cannot get buy-in. And we're kind of in big trouble and nobody wants to change. So I'm just curious, what you do in this situation, because it's not a matter of vision or seeing a way forward. It's that nobody wants to do what's necessary to make it happen.
Yeah, that presents an interesting question. That's kind of a question partly around organizational culture and what are the dynamics around how we make decisions within our organizational culture. So we will talk more about that. I think it's in the next session. So perhaps you hang on to that and let's see if we shed light. Here's one of the interesting things. I talk about I've talked over the years about these success factors and how, 17 of the 35 showed major correlations. And I have to admit that there were some that I was really rooting for personally that did not show high correlations. And one of those was tolerance of change, that I thought that organizations that demonstrate higher tolerance of change would tend to be more successful, and we didn't see a high correlation with that. But I think what you're talking about is an organization where change and change management is just very challenging. And I think that the challenge is going to be, well, how do we get people to think outside the box and entertain different ideas? There might be some ways to have facilitated conversations, short of actual therapy for the group. There might be ways to change the context, because it does sound like, you're hitting a wall. It's not so much the generating the ideas that's the problem. It's how do we get consensus, which really is a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Well,
Can you speak more about success factors correlated with positive changes, because that's really interesting to me that tolerance of changes doesn't seem to have a correlation with success.
Yeah, and so that's a preview of the next session, which is just in 1 week. So we will have a chance to talk about that. And just because something didn't show up as a success factor doesn't mean it's not important. And I think this is one thing I really like about having a series that you all are signing up for, because it gives us an opportunity to have continuity between sessions. And since we're just meeting in another week, I would see, and since that is more on topic there. I suggest we save that, and we will also have more time for discussion on that. I think this is very important question. Cannot understate its importance. How do we promote change in the organization? So I'd love to, I see that we're at
We're out of time.
15, we're out of time, but that's actually a nice way to end. So it's something we can take with us. So thank you. And by the way, who could you tell us your name, the gentleman who just spoke?
Yeah, Matthew, I'm at the Klamath Basin Senior Citizen Center.
Thank
Awesome.
you. Thank you, Matthew. So let's keep that point in mind. Also, we can have continuity if questions of this session occur to you in the next one, save them and bring them up. I want to thank everyone for today. We covered a lot of ground in the first session, and I'm really looking forward to next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.
Yeah, it's going to be really good. We're continuing to have enrollment and registration be open at least through this next week. So if you know someone that might be interested, NAO's plan as with Scott is this kind of long arc that ends with that more intensive group in the fall. So as many people as we can to these first 4 sessions. It's going to be recorded. And Scott, thank you so much. This has just been rich.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, NAO. And I look forward to seeing you all again in just 1 week.